Good morning.
Good morning.
So glad to see you all here this morning. And to the young guys, if I could get your help for just a moment today. Okay, we are going to be passing out some booklets. I'm really excited about these booklets this morning, y'all. This is a little bit different than what we've been doing before, a little bit different than the stuff we've been looking at, related to some of the same kind of material, but it's a very different kind of study. And so they're going to pass these out. No one's had these yet, so everyone needs one. And as well as there's a bucket of pens there, if y'all could pass those out to everybody. And we may have to double up. I don't have as many of these as I normally do, so we may need to double up on some of them. But let's try to everyone get one of these if possible. We're going to be looking at this booklet called Believe the Bible. And imagine this with me for a moment, if you will. That, as we've been training to help teach people what God's Word has to say about the gospel plan, as we've been training to do that, we've been considering how to teach people who really have very similar beliefs as far as if there is a God and things like that. But imagine if you sat down and you realized that the study that you were fixing to have is with someone who maybe, for example, doesn't yet believe that there is a God. And so using back to the Bible in a scenario where someone doesn't yet believe that there is a God isn't going to be a fitting kind of situation. It's not going to be a fitting study because back to the Bible, of course, uses it's a Bible study. And so if they're not even sure that there is a God, then we can't go straight to the Bible to start the study. We've got to kind of take a different route. And so that's where the booklets like Believe the Bible come in. And that's, before we start the study, we talk about, we take this survey. And the reason why we take the survey before we start the study is because if there is something like that, if there's some kind of different belief there than what we normally encounter, we don't want to jump right into back to the Bible. We want to jump into a different kind of study. And so as we kind of ask that first question, and that's, I'll say, I believe that there is a God and that He's made up of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Is that something that you believe? Most people in East Texas say yes to that. But every now and then you might get someone who says, no, I'm not sure that there is a God, or I don't believe that there is a God. And so we're not going to jump into back to the Bible. Instead, we're going to pull out this yellow booklet. It's called Believe the Bible. And you'll notice at the bottom it says it's Supplemental Lesson A. Right? We don't use this all the time. It's a supplement. We only use it if we need it. And this is about the affirmation of God. This is a really interesting sort of apologetic study that helps convince somebody that there is, in fact, a God. And so we turn to the first page there, and you'll notice at the very bottom it says, in order to complete this lesson, no belief in God or in the Bible is required. And that's important, because if they don't believe in God, then we don't want to study that requires a belief in God. We don't have to use the Bible or to believe in the Bible in order to complete this study. And so page 2 starts, it has an introduction, and it says, in this essence, you could just read this out loud. If you're the teacher, just read this out loud to who you're studying with. It says, belief in a higher being should be the product of sound reasoning. All that's really saying is if somebody believes in a God, it shouldn't be just because we've taken a wild leap in the dark and just sort of hope that it's true. If somebody believes in a God, it's not because we've just kind of jumped and think, I sure hope there is one, but it's because there's some kind of evidence, right? And we've reasoned through the evidence. We've come to a logical conclusion. There's a sound and solid reason to believe that there is a God. And so all that we ask of anyone is just that they have an open mind and just apply their reasoning abilities to some simple questions and just draw some natural conclusions from that. And so there are a few Bible verses kind of sprinkled throughout the book. And that's, all that is every apologetic argument that this book uses, it's because God makes that argument in Scripture, right? Every apologetic argument that this book uses comes from some idea that God has placed in Scripture. And we'll kind of see that as we go through there. But we don't have to, with someone who doesn't believe in God, we're not going to open up our Bibles to show them that. We're just going to ask them questions, much like Jesus did. He would just ask people questions to help them reason through those things. And so the first argument we're starting with here, who or what was in the beginning? And you see on the bottom of the page, it says Genesis 1:1. The questions on this page that as we go through this, they are drawing the argument from the concept that is in Genesis 1:1. And we're not opening up to Genesis 1:1 or reading that. We're just asking these questions, but we know these are biblical arguments that God has given us. And so he says, do you believe that the material world had a beginning? Right? And as we're asking these questions we're asking the student to answer these questions, recognize that what we're asking is we're asking people to have a reasonable response to questions, right? We're looking for those people who maybe they don't believe in God, but they are reasonable people. And that's a reasonable person is going to be able to understand and work through this. Now, if you study with someone who's not reasonable, right? Someone who isn't open-minded, someone who doesn't want to understand these things, what do you do about that? You can't make somebody be open-minded. You can't make somebody be reasonable. But a reasonable person who's open-minded can go through this study, and you'll watch and see how it's capable of building someone's confidence that perhaps there is a God. And so if you ask a reasonable person, do you believe the material world had a beginning? That's a yes. The material world must have had a beginning. Do you believe the material world created itself from nothing? Well, no. Reasonable people don't believe that nothing, even people who teach macroevolution, it sounds like it comes from nothing, but they don't believe it really came from nothing, right? They have different theories about that. Most people don't believe that the material universe actually came from nothing. Do you believe it is possible that there was an energy in the beginning, one that can't be created or destroyed, that could have been responsible for creating the world? And notice, we're not asking them to commit to this idea or to say they believe in this idea. We're just saying, do you believe it's possible? Well, sure, that must be a possibility. Even if you're not sure if there's a God, you could say that that's a possibility at least. Would you be open to the possibility that this energy could be called God? And a reasonable person will say, well, sure, that's a possibility that we're not asking them to commit to it. That just is a possibility that could be true. On page 3, all right, we're going to really start our full first argument, and that is a building requires a builder. A building requires a builder. Does every house have a builder? Have you ever looked at a house and thought, well, that just shows... we see it, we know that someone must have built it. Isn't it impossible for a house to build itself? Right? We know if there's a house there, someone must have put it there. Wouldn't it be equally absurd to suggest that an infant could build a house? Well, sure it would. And the reason why is, and they might give any number of reasons, but we understand it. They don't have the ability. They don't have the experience. They don't have the strength. It's not possible for an infant to build a house. Could a house appear from nothing? We understand. Someone put the work in to put it there. Is it possible that a house has always existed, or in other words, that it's eternal? Right? You look at the house we live in next door, and no one thinks that it's been there forever and ever, or any house has been there forever and ever, right? It's not possible. And so must the builder of the house be greater in ability and power than the house? In other words, don't they have to have some kind of tool or strength that allows them to build that house? Well, absolutely. If a house requires a builder, is it possible that, and again, we're not asking them if they believe this, just is it possible? And you see what we've done here is we've taken something very commonplace. That's what Jesus did. He took commonplace things, farming and agriculture, buildings, all kinds of commonplace things as a parable so that he could build to a spiritual point. That's all this booklet is doing. It started with something commonplace, a house, and then it's going to build it to something bigger. So isn't it possible that a universe would require a builder if a house does? A house is just made of things. A universe is just made of things. A reasonable person could say, that's possible. That's possible that it could require a builder. Go on to page 4. We're just continuing the same argument about the house. Every effect must have a sufficient cause. Every effect must have a sufficient cause. Is the existence of the universe greater than the existence of a house? In other words, isn't it just much bigger, more impressive than a house? Well, sure, the universe is that. Do you believe that it would be impossible for the universe to create itself? That's, a reasonable person doesn't think that you can just pop into existence of your own will if you didn't exist before. And so, no. Yes. Wouldn't it be impossible for the universe to have come from nothing? That's impossible. Wouldn't it be equally impossible for a man to have created the universe? Men build some impressive things, skyscrapers and all kinds of neat things, but no man has ever built anything quite as impressive as an entire universe. It's just not possible. Must the builder of the universe come from outside the universe itself? That's if something is in the universe, it's a part of it. It was created with the universe. And so certainly the builder must come from outside of the universe itself. Must the builder of the universe be greater in ability and power than the universe? And so you see, all the things we said about the house, right? We're just applying them now to the universe. And we're seeing what was true about the house is true about the universe. The person who built the universe, if such a person existed, must have the tools or power, the strength to build that universe. Must the builder of the universe be older than the universe? Of course, we wouldn't. The baby who's born in the house never built the house, right? They've got to be older than the universe. And does the fact that we apply a date to the universe imply it had a beginning and therefore has not always existed? Right? Almost every scientist will tell you that there is a date when it began. Great disagreements about what that date is, but they all apply some kind of date to when it started, and so that certainly implies that there's some kind of beginning to the universe. If it is not possible for material things to be eternal, then could it be possible for something non-material, a power like mind or spirit, to be eternal? In other words, man can make things, right? We can build toys, or we can build buildings, we can make material things, and we are material, we have flesh ourselves. But something that created the first material thing must itself not be material, right? Or else it just goes on and on. What created the first material thing? And so it'd have to be something like a spirit of some kind. Remember back on page 2, we asked, is it possible that there was an energy, or maybe like a spirit, that created everything? That's what he's talking about here. And so it describes it there. It says the first law of thermodynamics, right? Now, you don't have to be a science teacher or to know a lot about science. You don't have to be an expert in science to teach this booklet to somebody. All the information that you need is right here in the booklet. It says the first law of thermodynamics, energy can be neither created nor destroyed. Right? So if there is some kind of being that created everything, it couldn't be a material being because material is not eternal. It's got to be some kind of energy. And it's a law of science that energy is not created nor destroyed. You and I can't take energy and get rid of it entirely. It just takes a different form. It just goes somewhere else. Right? We can't make energy out of nothing. We have to pull it from the sun or something like that. And so if there were an energy that created everything, then it would have to be eternal, right? That's what they're asking there. And then if we called that eternal power God, is it possible that God could be eternal and also the builder of the universe? And so again, we're not asking them to commit to believing it. We're just asking, is it possible? This is only our first argument, right? They're not going to be convinced in just one argument. but is it possible? A reasonable person, if they're following the logic, would say it's at least possible that something called God could be eternal and the builder of the universe. Continue on page 6, and still with this kind of a branch of the same argument. And I love this argument. I'm so glad that they chose to use this argument. It's a really interesting and effective argument. It says, every design must have a designer. Wouldn't it be impossible for a camera to build itself? Well, that, of course it would be impossible. You've never looked at a camera. You know, if you looked at a camera, you think somebody had to make that. Can a camera appear from nothing? Well, of course not. Cameras have a maker. Does the existence of a camera demand that it came from something? Absolutely. Wouldn't the creation of a camera require someone superior and exterior as the creator? Right? So we're making some of those same arguments about the house and the universe. Wouldn't it be absurd to believe that a camera could be created by an explosion in a parts factory? And I see I skipped one of the questions, but the answer to that is yes, right? Explosions cause chaos, don't they? Explosions cause damage and destruction. They don't create or make order out of things. The question I skipped is, does the camera demonstrate complex design? Well, absolutely it does. If you've ever taken apart even the most simple of cameras, and that's, you all know I have a background in journalism, and in college I took classes on photography. In my career, I took lots of pictures with lots of kind of cameras. They're fascinating, and one of the things I learned about cameras is they're built off of the human eye, right? They're trying to model the human eye, and so you open up a camera and you look inside, and it's got shutters, and it's got glass, and it's got all kinds of complex parts, and so absolutely it does. And then, as we said, it can't be made by an explosion. Is the human eye greater than the camera? And it's greater than because the human eye is more complex. It has more power. It can do more things than a camera can. The people who make the cameras, that's what they're modeling it off of. They're trying to make it as close to the human eye as they can, but a camera doesn't have periphery like the human eye does. A camera can't switch focus as quickly as the human eye can. A camera can't do 3/4 of the things that the human eye can, and so the human eye is certainly greater than the camera. If a camera requires a superior and exterior creator, then wouldn't the human eye also require a superior and exterior creator? And that's, you've never looked at a camera and thought something that complex came out just by accident. It just appeared one day. But the human eye is more complex. If the human eye is more complex, then how could it just appear by accident one day? Someone must have designed it if it is more complex. And so these summary questions are, does a design require a designer? Absolutely. Does the universe demonstrate characteristics of design? It does. Does the human body demonstrate characteristics of design? It does. Wouldn't it be reasonable to conclude that the universe must have a designer? And this repetition is important, right? Because you're dealing with someone who doesn't yet believe there is a God. They need to see the overwhelming amount of evidence that points to there being a God, and that's why this repetition is here. This is likely, if they're a reasonable, open-minded person, this is likely the first time that they're going to come across some of this information. That they've been raised or trained up in some way that has maybe hidden this information from them and given them a different worldview. And so you want that repetition because you want them to begin to be overwhelmed by the evidence. Look how much evidence there is that a God exists. Now we've only done the first argument, and so we're not asking that they believe in God yet. They're not going to be convinced by one argument. We go on to our second argument. Where do we get morality? Where do we get morality? If a national law required you to exterminate all blonde-haired people, would that law be moral or immoral? Right? Just dig down deep in your gut, and you know the answer right away. Right? It doesn't matter if it's national law or not. you know it's just wrong to exterminate somebody just based on the color of their hair. And so a reasonable person is going to say that that would be immoral. Same thing if it's not a national law. Let's say it's the law of majority that requires it. In other words, that most of the leaders or the majority of the people require it. Is it moral or is it immoral? It doesn't matter if it's national law or if it's the law of majority, it would be immoral. Or the third one, if international law required it, even if it was a law that governed the whole world, if they decided one day we're going to exterminate all blonde-haired people, we would say that's not fair. We know it within ourselves. That's not right. That's immoral. If there is a law that would protect all blonde-haired people from the majority national or international law, right? Is there some kind of law that says this is wrong to exterminate blonde-haired people no matter what the other laws say? Now, if we're reasoning through this, right, what we understand is, even if we don't know what that law is, we understand there must be some kind of law because all reasonable people inherently understand it's just wrong to wipe out people based on the color of their hair. Right? So what is that law? Now at this point, they might just not know, right? I don't know what that law is. That's okay, right? We understand this is moral law, or you could call it divine law, right? This is a law that comes from something higher. Where does it come from? Again, they might not be ready to commit yet to where it comes from. This is only our second argument, but we understand it comes from God. And it's all right if they don't come to that conclusion on page 8, because page 9 is going to kind of help explain that. Morals must have a moral lawgiver. Right? This is the argument that we're making. Did moral law require Nazis to disobey the German law to exterminate the Jews? Right? Now, what that's really asking is, if you were a Nazi and the Nazi national law said it's your job to exterminate all the Jews, do you have to obey that? Or is there another law that your conscience knows, that you feel within yourself that exterminating a race just because it's their race require that you disobey the German law? Right? We understand it when it comes to doing something truly evil, even if a government tells us to, we don't do that thing. There's something higher that's even more than German law. Does moral law require a moral lawgiver, right? Someone to create it? If there is, right, just they're reasoning through this with us. If there is a law, then there must be a lawgiver. There has to be someone who made that law. Wouldn't it be dangerous for moral law to come from one human, right? Like Hitler, for example. There are some great people in the world, but none of them are perfect enough to be the one person to decide what moral law is. Wouldn't it be dangerous for moral law to come from one nation, for example, like Nazi Germany? Certainly that's a dangerous precedent to set. Wouldn't it be dangerous for moral law to come from an international body like the United Nations? Even an international body gets things wrong sometimes. That's a dangerous thing to happen. And so when the Nazi leaders were convicted of violating moral law and sentenced to death, right? And this is a historical thing that happened. Did they violate German law? Right? Now here, they're going to cheat for us, right? They're going to give us the answer, just in case someone's not familiar with the history of it. Right? There's a note there so that we make sure we understand this, right? The note is, they were following German law, right? So they've just given us the answer there. But when we think about it, it's when they were convicted of violating the moral law, they were not in opposition of German law. They didn't break any German laws. German law said exterminate the Jews, and so it wasn't their own country's laws that led to their sentence of death. When they were convicted of violating moral law and sentenced to death, did they violate international law? And again, they're going to cheat for us here. There's a note. There was no international law at that time. And so, no, right? They weren't in violation of any international law. That's not the law that they were sentenced to death by. When Nazi leaders were convicted of violating moral law and sentenced to death, did they violate U.S. law? Right? And the note is, Nazis were German citizens. German citizens, no matter what U.S. laws are, they're not subject to U.S. laws. And so the answer is no. They didn't break any of those laws on earth. By what law did the Nuremberg trials convict the Nazis? It's not any earthly law, not their own country, not international, nothing. The only law that they broke was moral law. They broke some kind of higher law. And so there's a couple of quotes here. It says, Nazi Nuremberg trials. On July 27th, 1946, Sir Hartley Shawcross, chief prosecutor of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, asserted the basis for human behavior, ultimately the rights of men, made as all men are made in the image of God, are fundamental. Right? That's our own Constitution says something very similar, that there is certain inherent rights because we're created in God's image, that there's some kind of higher law than even national or international law that we are subject to. In the Nuremberg trials, 1946, Chief Justice Robert Jackson said, as an international military tribunal, it rises above the provincial and transient. And that's moral law is higher than any kind of earthly law. And so we have some summary questions. If God did not exist, would objective moral values exist? In other words, would every reasonable person inherently understand that exterminating an entire group of people based on skin or hair color or something is wrong? Would we all understand that inherently if there wasn't some kind of, if God didn't exist to create that law, that understanding in us? No, that's not possible. If there wasn't a God to create that, then there'd be no standard by which we would understand that. Do you believe that objective moral values exist? A reasonable person has to say yes to this. Why is that? Because they've already said it, right? They understand it's immoral to wipe out a group of people based on hair color. And so, therefore, if all reasonable people understand that, then there must be an objective moral value that exists. Therefore, would you agree that God could exist? Now, again, this is only our second argument. We're not asking them to commit to believing in God yet. We're still just asking, based on the evidence, isn't it possible, if there is some kind of higher law that transcends any human law, then there must be a lawmaker that gave us that. And so, yes, it's possible that God could exist. Does evil exist? We just talked about Nazi Germany. It's hard to say no to does evil exist. What's an example of evil? They might give you any kind of example, but the obvious one based on what we've just read is murder. But whatever example they might give is fine. What standard law would you use to define evil? Right? We've already said it can't be international law. It can't be national. They're not. Those are fallible laws. It's got to be something higher than that. It's got to be God's laws, or they might just say moral law if they're not ready to commit to the idea of God's laws, but something higher than that. Does the existence of good require the existence of evil? Now, I think what they mean by this question, what they mean is when you see evil, it helps you identify that there is good, doesn't it? Right? There's a difference there, or vice versa. When you've seen good, helps you know when there's evil. And so, yes is the answer there. What standard law would you use to define goodness then? We see evil and that helps us know good, or vice versa, but how do we really know what's good or what's evil? It's that higher law. It's the moral law. That's the law that comes from the lawmaker. That's the law that comes from God. Right? And so all these principles come from, for example, Mark 10:18 and things like this. But we're just working through them question style, much like Jesus often did. Our third argument then, do animals show us God? Do animals show us God? We look in nature. Is a tiger that escapes from a zoo and slays a helpless child taken to prison and given a trial? Doesn't happen. We understand animals operate on instinct, and so that's not how it works. Is a human who murders a helpless child taken to prison and given a trial. And we're speaking generally speaking, right? In an ideal society, that's usually what happens. Do animals have morality? We don't hold them accountable for their actions because they just operate off of instinct, right? Do humans have morality? Certainly, that's why we try people in court. If humans have morality and animals do not, from where does morality come from? Now, maybe they just say, I don't know, because they're not ready to admit it yet, but we understand where they're leading us. It comes from God. Does an animal have a conscience? They know the difference between right and wrong. They just operate off of instinct. Does a human have a conscience? Sometimes, even when humans are, sometimes it's like you get onto your puppy because they chewed up your shoes, right? And they look sad, don't they? They look like they really feel bad about what they've done. They don't like being caught and being told not to do that is what they really don't like, isn't it? Because when you turn their back, they do it again, don't they? But humans can even feel bad for things, even if they're not caught. Even if no one knows that they did it, we have a conscience that tells us sometimes if we've done right or wrong. Does a lion feel remorse after killing its prey? I've never asked a lion how it feels about it, but it's just operating off of instincts. Do most humans feel remorse after killing another human being? Right? We're talking about reasonable people, even people who they have the right to, police officers and soldiers that are in the line of duty and have an obligation to use their gun against someone else. They still struggle with feeling remorse about it afterwards, even though it was the right thing to do. People generally feel remorse after killing another human being. If a human has a conscience and an animal does not, from where does the conscience come? Where could that come from? And maybe they're not ready to say it yet, but we know that it's God. If a conscience were the result of purely random chemical processes, could we trust it? And this is the argument of the Big Bang Theory, is over, the millennia, chemicals sort of combined to form the idea of the conscience. Well, we could not trust a conscience that was truly made by chemicals. And so when all reasonable people understand it's wrong to exterminate someone based on the color of their hair, that would be an untrustworthy feeling because it just came from chemicals. It's not trustworthy. But if the conscience were designed and created by a moral lawgiver, generally speaking, could we trust it? Absolutely. If it's telling us the same as the moral lawgiver is, we can trust that conscience because he is, as it says, moral. All right, page 14. Page 14. Pain and suffering are a blessing from God. Right, now, bear with me through this one. Right. Does pain serve as a warning device when you place your hands on a hot stove? Right? I remember I did that once as a kid. I wasn't eager to do it again. It stung. What would happen to your hand if you placed it on a hot stove and you could not feel pain? Right? You may leave it there for a long time. You may cause irreparable damage. You're at least going to get burned, right? This pain is useful in that sense. When you place your hand on a hot stove, are you making a choice? Now, we know accidents happen, but generally speaking, if you choose to put it right, you are making a choice to do that. Would your free will be removed if you were forced to keep your hand away from a hot stove, right? You're the kid that just keeps on doing it. So your mother, she ties you up over here so you stop touching the hot stove when she's cooking, right? You don't have the free will. You cannot make the choice to do it. And so, yes, that would remove your free will. Is the law of gravity, and this is a law, the law of gravity constant and dependable? Now, I don't know about you. I've never seen gravity stop working. Right? It's always there. What would happen if the law of gravity were random? That would be chaos. You'd be walking down the street and suddenly you'd be floating off to Mars and you'd have no way to stop it. We'd all tether ourselves to something and then that would float away too, that would be chaos. What will happen if you choose to test the law of gravity by jumping off of a cliff? If it's high enough, you are going to seriously injure yourself or maybe even die. If you decide to test the law of gravity and you suffer from a fall, who is to blame for that? A lot of times when we suffer in life, people say, well, that's God's fault, right? But in these kinds of things, if I'm old enough to understand gravity, I'm old enough to know that gravity is a constant law that never fails, and I just decide anyway, I'm jumping off of a cliff with no protection at all, I am responsible for whatever happens. It's my choice. If you benefit from the law of gravity, whom should you praise? Again, if there is a law of gravity, then there has to be a lawmaker, someone who made the law of gravity. And so if we benefit from the law of gravity, we should praise God for giving us that law that helps us out. We should praise, maybe they just say the lawmaker, right? They're not right, but we should praise God for that. And so what we're showing them here, there are so many people in the world who come to the conclusion that there is no God, or at least that if there is, he's evil, because there's pain and suffering in the world. And so what we're dealing with here is that there can be a good God who he does allow us to have pain in our lives, but we understand that often that's because we have free will. And so if we're gonna have free will, then there must then be pain, because we can choose painful things. Right? And so that's what we're showing them here. Page 16. Page 16. Punishment is a requirement of God. In other words, he's required sometimes to punish. Does justice, also called righteousness, demand that a judge punish convicted criminals? That is the just thing for a judge to do, to convict or to punish or condemn convicted criminals. If a convicted criminal is set free with no penalty, would the judge be just? Right? You have a judge, and the lawyers have come forward, and they have proven by boxes and rooms of evidence that this person is a serial killer, and they've murdered all of these people, and the jury has seen it, and they have determined without a shadow of a doubt that he is guilty. And the judge says, when I go home at night and I try to eat my Wheaties, it just makes me feel uncomfortable in my stomach to think that I sent this man to prison, or that I sent him to death row. And so I know that all the evidence is there, but I just can't make myself do it. I can't make myself punish him for what he's done. Like, that's not a just judge. He just sent a serial killer back into society to continue what it is that he was doing. He's just put the innocent and those who can't defend themselves in danger because he doesn't want to pass judgment. Right? It's not just for a judge to set someone free if they've been convicted. Does the punishment by a judge of a convicted criminal make the judge unloving? No, of course not. His love certainly is a protective kind of love to keep people safe. It could be his own son or her own husband that was the one that was convicted. It doesn't mean that the judge doesn't love them. For the judge to do a good job at what they're supposed to do. Can a judge be both just in his ruling and loving to all people? That's justice and love are not mutually exclusive things. If God is just, is he required to punish the guilty? Right? So same as the house, right? We've taken the human example, the parable, the earthly example, and we're given it a spiritual application. If the human judge must do his job, then God, as judge, is right to do his job. He is required to punish the guilty. If God did not punish those who are guilty, would he be just? It's the same thing as the human judge. He could not be just if he did not fulfill his role as judge. Does the punishment of God, of those who are guilty, make God unloving? Again, those are not mutually exclusive things. That does not make God unloving. Can God be both just and loving to all? Really, you think about it, justice and love are more the ideas that go hand in hand. Justice is about fairness. Justice is about what's right, and those go hand in hand with love. And so, absolutely, he can be both of those things. We have some concluding questions then. And it says ask yourself, but we would read it out loud to them and have them answer it. Is it reasonable to believe if nothing existed in the beginning, then nothing would exist now? Right? That's a reasonable thing to believe. If there was always nothing, there would still be nothing. Is it reasonable to believe that the earth, with all its complexities, came from nothing, or that it was created? As if the house has a creator, then the universe, the earth, must have a creator. Is it reasonable to believe that the human body, with all its complexities, is an accident, or that it was designed? As complex as a camera is, the human must have a design. Is it reasonable to believe morality can exist without a moral lawgiver? If there is a moral law, it must have a moral lawgiver. Is it reasonable to believe the existence of morality is due to the existence of a moral lawgiver? Certainly. Is it reasonable to believe that pain is a warning device designed for our benefit? That's a reasonable thing to believe. Is it reasonable to believe that one can be just and punish evildoers without being unloving? We sure hope so. That's what we want for our judges in the United States. That's what we want from a judge over the universe. Is it reasonable to believe in the existence of a supreme and eternal being or God? If they are following you through all of this logic, if they are saying, right, and we didn't just give them one argument, we gave them argument after argument after argument after argument, and that's one argument on its own maybe wouldn't convince somebody. But when you look at the overwhelming amount of evidence, and of course there's a lot more things we could have said, a lot more things we could have looked at, but to do a study in a short amount of time, even this is a lot of evidence of proof of not asking someone to just believe because we say so, not asking someone to just believe because we feel it deep within ourselves that there must be a God, but asking someone to believe because there is evidence that if we really look at how things truly are, it must be a God that made all of this and that exists, that a reasonable person, maybe they'll need some time to think about it, but a reasonable person is not going to walk away with this and say, I just can't believe in a God after this. There's just too much evidence. And so what you've done is you sat down for a Bible study and you wanted to teach someone the gospel, and you discovered that they don't believe in a God. And so now you're able to take a reasonable person through to the place where they could say, I feel pretty confident now that there could be a God. And so perhaps then you're ready to go back to the Bible, and you're ready to walk them through now so that they can see what God's plan is. If there is a lawmaker, if there is a God, that he must have a message for us. And that's what we would then lead into in hopes of reaching to that point where they can decide for themselves, is there or isn't there a God? They can decide for themselves, do they or don't they want the plan of salvation that God has offered to them? And it's a question that we all must ask ourselves at some point in our life. Do I or don't I believe what God has said? Do I or don't I want the plan of salvation that God has offered us? And this morning, if we can help you to further yourself in that journey, to draw closer to God, to know more about what God has said, or if we can offer you prayers or something that you need, we'd ask that you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.